Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sift through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler. And today we're going to talk about
what's the upcoming season of Stoicism. So every year in the month of October, and now it's actually going into November, so you can identify it with fall, there's a lot of activity around modern Stoicism. We have a big conference called Stoicon that happens every year. This time, of course, it's virtually because COVID. And there's a 1-week class that thousands of people take called Stoic Week. It was originally called Live Like a Stoic, and people do exactly that. And then there's all sorts of other cool events happening. And what's really great about this year is that so many of these events, almost all of them actually, the only one that's not virtual is one in Russia that I guess they're less concerned about COVID than everybody else in the world. But for the most part, all of these events are virtual. So even if they're staged in Australia or, like ours is here in Milwaukee, anybody anywhere in the world can participate in them, provided, I guess, that they have the right time zone, so they're not, in the middle of the night or something like that. But even night owls could get in on it. So we have this big season coming up, and Dan and I thought we would revisit Stoicism since the episode that we devoted to it, we didn't get through everything that we wanted to. And there's also been a recent development in the news that we're going to talk about, involving an unemployment, or rather a firing claim in a foreign country, and somebody using Stoicism as, what would you call it, like an excuse, a cover for doing some rather unstoic activities.
a shield.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think Stoicism was quite meant to be used that way, but we'll get to that. So,
right.
One of the things that I'm going to be doing a talk about later on in this season is whether it's okay for a Stoic to get excited about Stoic Week, because in the past, I've posted that I'm very much looking forward to it. I'm excited about Stoic Week or Stoicon, and then I would have some people criticizing me, saying it's not Stoic to be too excited about anything. And I've got some responses for that, but I'm curious to hear what you think about that. Is it that the wrong thing to do? Is that a misunderstanding of what Stoicism would entail to get excited about something?
Well, I guess you'd go to one of the pro-social emotions of the wish, and that you're wishing for things that have a high probability of happening. That especially that are under your control to a certain extent, and since you're the one that's organizing this, and you put all the wheels in motion, and there's so many of them going forward, that the probability that at least one of these events will go on is is rather high. And so as long as you're not desiring them to happen, that you desire what happens to happen, you can still have these goals, and to it is rational to think that these things will happen. These are not outside of the norm things.
Yeah, what we translate as wish, boulesis in Greek, it can be translated also as rational desire. So it's desiring things, but in a way that actually makes sense, rather than, so let's take Stoicon, for example. In the past, it was this big face-to-face conference, and you'd have all these big speakers who are well known in the Stoic community. That's why it's a con in the first place, just like, any other thing, whether it's comic books or cars or, I guess sports. So, you got these speakers, and you get to meet them, and you get to meet other people who are interested in what you're interested in, and you go to workshops, and, there's going to be some hassles, of course. There'll be crowds, and maybe there'll be some people there who are kind of disagreeable. There always are. And, maybe, if you have to fly, like I went to Stoicons in Toronto, in New York, and in London. And I chose not to go to Greece because I was like, that's going to be way too much hassle for me, to try to get there during the school year. So I didn't go to last year's. But anytime that you're like stepping on a plane's, you're walking through that hallway, getting onto the plane, things can get screwed up and probably will get screwed up. Something's going to go wrong, right? So it's not rational to expect everything to conform to your desires, but you could still say, oh man, I'm going to get to meet so-and-so. I'm going to get to talk to this person whose book I read. I'm going to hear a really great discussion about this with this panel. I think that's something that a person can look forward to. And, and if it doesn't turn out that well, like let's say the speaker has laryngitis and they bring in somebody else instead, or they cancel that part of the event, well, that's where what we call the reserve clause comes in, right?
Right.
So we should talk about that.
The reserve clause is, this is something you see in, I guess, a number of philosophies as well as religions. In Christianity, you'll often hear the saying "God willing," and the reserve clause within Stoicism is "fate willing."
So, what does that mean, though? What's the difference between fate and God? Is there a difference there?
I guess it depends on your person that you're asking.
Okay.
If you're a theist, then especially if you're of a certain Abrahamic faith, then there is a plan, and so I guess God and fate would be directly intertwined. If you go by like the ancient Stoics, they refer to nature and the universe and Zeus and God as all kind of interchangeably, and so nature is to a certain extent fate, and that that is the way that things will happen.
Yeah, actually, that's a good launching point for bringing up something. So when we think about religions, and this case that we're going to talk about does touch on Stoicism viewed as something almost like a religion. We think about like prayer and rituals and stuff like that, and Stoicism doesn't have that. So if you're getting on the plane and suddenly you're in the air, there's a big jolt, some turbulence, and you look out the window and like the engine's on fire, and you're like, oh, that's bad, right? Goose flew into it or something like that. Maybe a Christian would start praying at that point. Oh,
wait, actually, I need to hold up.
Okay,
is it bad
if a goose flies into the engine? Well, from a Stoic perspective, you're saying, right?
Yes.
It is.
We were talking about Stoicism.
It's certainly bad for the plane. It's certainly bad for the goose. And the Stoics don't say that death is totally, indifferent, right? Ideally, you want people not to die
But you shouldn't be living in fear of death.
Exactly. Yeah. So the Stoic, wouldn't start praying because Zeus isn't going to change anything. Zeus is sort of like already made it clear what's going to happen.
So, like, either there's enough engines still on the plane that you'll eventually land, and
the pilots can do it, right?
Right. Like hopefully Sully's in there, right? And or it's not, and unless you have some like control over the plane, unless you're the pilot here. Or you can somehow do something to materially change the events that are happening.
Yeah.
Well, then just kind of amor fati, love fate.
That's actually. We're talking about a very literal thing, but that's actually a great metaphor. You're along for the ride on so much, right? If you're not the pilot or the co-pilot, or somebody who actually has a pilot's license and training, and maybe can step in and do something. You're not going to determine what happens with that plane. You can decide, when the oxygen mask comes down to like panic or not, or put on your mask calmly, but that's about it. So,
right? How many Newton pounds of force do you want to exert on that like hand rest as you're going down?
Well, yeah, I suppose that's within your power as well, right? I don't. Yeah, I don't really know what else. You could decide to call the stewardess or the flight attendant, yeah, over and say, "Can I have one more drink, please?" That might be something people would do, or yeah. But so these are some good examples of differences between theistic and then Stoic ideas about things. There's, Epictetus actually says, hey, you can go do these rituals of divination if you want to, but you probably should avoid it and only do it if you like totally can't figure it out on your own. It's almost like the today's thing where people email you or have comments and they ask you questions and you're like, man, you can Google that. Why don't you do some work on your own and figure it out, right? It's sort of like the Stoic gods are saying, you need to figure this out on your own, people. You're rational. We gave you a rational mind. It wasn't just for you to put aside and then constantly bug us with your questions.
It reminds me of, I believe it's Chrysippus, who talks about the idea of fate and the way that we deal with fate in the vignette of a dog tied to the back of a wagon.
Now this is probably not going to be all that appealing to the listeners, I imagine.
Well, it's kind of like fate in this context is the wagon. It's going forward, and you are the dog, and you can either pull against your leash and fight and curse at fate all you want
and get
the
dragged along.
Yeah, or you can kind of go with it. And so that's this kind of central idea of like what is under your control.
Yeah.
A lot of times it's the way that you are looking at the world and not your ability to actually change.
Something that, and it may have been a part of that original idea because we don't have like Chrysippus's writings. If you think about it, if you are that dog and you're running alongside the wagon where it's going, now you actually have some play. You could go this way or that way, up to how far the leash is. Whereas if you're just allowing yourself to be dragged, well, you're at the end of the leash and you're going wherever the wagon goes, and you're not going to be able to have any real scope for things.
I guess I'd always kind of added that on. Maybe that was just me reading into it, but yeah, I'd absolutely agree with the idea that there is room to play with the leash and the amount that you're given.
Yeah, that's kind of that makes it a little bit more of an attractive prospect then.
Maybe it's kind of like the idea that we're all on this earth and we can go and do anything that we want on this earth, but that earth is going to still rotate around the sun.
Yeah.
Until we're all dead. And we have lots of play and we can do lots of really cool things, but there's almost nothing that we're ever going to do to change the
vast order of things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think too, another thing you can say about that is there's certain constants of human nature that you can't, you can try to push against them, but they're always going to come back at you and you can't really avoid them. So, like people think that they can do bad things and it's just this once and it's not really going to have any lasting effects in the world and it's not actually going to affect their character. But that's not the way things were made, and you might be able to get away with something once and you're lucky that it doesn't have a bad effect. But sooner or later you do bad things, it's going to lead to bad effects and it's going to affect you as a person as well. And likewise, doing good things.
And it's not just that the bad effects are external bad effects. It's not just like the legal system or someone's going to come back and try to exact some revenge, but it's also changing your character and the decisions that you make because you are kind of what you repeatedly do. Right.
Yeah. I think this is something the Stoics were very attuned to, the force of habit in producing sort of reliably good or bad actions, and not just actions, but ways of reading the situation, ways of motivating ourselves, ways of prioritizing. That's a really important point. Although, you can find that in most virtue ethics, I'd say, right?
Yeah. Not only just habits, but also reviewing those habits to review your day or your week and try to think back, because a lot of times it's you're in the moment, and because we already have a number of habits that are built in from our upbringing, that those things have to kind of be unlearned if we find them to be bad, and a lot of times we could do them unconsciously.
Yeah, so that's a good point. And now you're bringing that out of Stoicism, right? That's a Stoic practice that's kind of basic. this review at certain times of the day.
Well, it's actually like the review that Marcus Aurelius uses is actually cribbed from the Pythagoreans.
That's right. It goes way back further than that. So
so that's the what have I done well? What have I failed at? What could I do better?
Yeah. That's often quite helpful to do as a practice. And at first, like most things, it feels weird and you don't really want to do it, even though you've told yourself that it would be a good thing for you to do. But after a while, it becomes your normal routine, right? Part of your how you finish up the day.
Yeah, and it's really like if you have trouble sleeping, sometimes it's just those thoughts running through your head, and getting them down on paper are useful. And one of the things that usually runs through people's heads are them ruminating about the actions and the interactions that they have with other people in the world that day.
Yeah. I think something that probably keeps a lot of people up at night too is like what they didn't do or what they forgot to do. So
that's why I also write in my journal all the things that I want to do tomorrow, so that one, I don't forget them, and two, that I don't have to think about what I'm doing the next day.
Yeah, you externalize or you get it out of your head, so to speak, right?
Right.
So yeah, we've already talked about a couple different important Stoic practices just in this little segment here. Then, do we want to hit on any other one in particular? Or? I know we saved one for the end, right?
Yeah, I think we should talk about the idea of being pro-social within Stoicism.
Yeah, this is something that I would say we can't stress enough, because there's so many misunderstandings about this, particularly just coming from the word Stoic with like a lowercase s that people use today to describe somebody who's unattached, unemotional, not engaged with other people, withdrawing from everybody else, and that's just not Stoicism. It was, as a philosophy, Stoicism with a capital S at all, right? It looks like you're getting a passage ready. You got something? Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
So this is from Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. It's my favorite passage from the book, book 2, first section, and halfway through it goes, nor can I feel angry at my relative or hate him. These people that he has to deal with that are unhelpful and annoying,
to say the least.
But we were born to work together like 2 feet, hands and eyes, like the 2 rows of teeth, upper and lower. To obstruct each other is unnatural. To feel anger at someone, to turn your back on him, these are obstructions.
Now, what does that mean for the listener? Obstructions.
They're obstructions to one's own well-being, as well as obstructions to kind of the order of things, as this idea of a cosmopolitanism, that we are all part of a larger tribe, the tribe of rational agents.
Yeah,
and that we should be working together to benefit us all.
Yeah, I think that's a key Stoic idea. Epictetus uses the metaphor of like bodily parts as well, and talks about, if a foot were to say, I don't want to go in the mud, I want to be, beautiful like the eye, it's not a very good foot at all,
No.
The eye's got a totally different function. And so, we've all got our parts to play, and, we play those parts better when we're not trying to make our own position be the one that matters the most, when we're actually working in cooperation with other people. Imagine if the foot was like, I don't want this blood coming from all these other parts of the body. I don't know where that stuff has been. Those dirty fingers and organs. Look at how gross they are inside. I just want the blood that I've got here. I mean, it wouldn't last as a foot very long, would it? So
no. And it kind of hammers home the idea that not only like each part has a function that is necessary to work together, that we should not be, looking down on those people just because of the positions that they're holding. That we all have a place to play for the betterment of us all, and that there shouldn't be any real derision for any person that has a place in society that is beneficial to society.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. I mean, I can't think of any classic Stoic passage that comes to mind about that, except where Epictetus talks about slaves. And he was a slave himself, and he says that actually Seneca talks about slaves in a similar light as well. He says we have to look at these as human beings, which is kind of a radical way to talk at the time. And each one of them is in a certain way just as good as us because they've got this. Epictetus speaks in very religious terms. They got this little piece of God inside of them, the rational part. But
a shard of the divine, or
the divine. Without going into God talk, I think we could say everyone, by virtue of being a human being, participates in this basic human nature of rationality. And it's not just like cold, calculating, turn your emotions off rationality. Properly oriented and developed emotions are part of human rationality as well, And so I guess there is something like that. But what you said it goes beyond that a little bit, I'd say.
Maybe that's just my modern reading of it.
So that's a good, we said we weren't going to talk about the difference between ancient and modern Stoicism, but it kind of raises that question. Do we need to reinterpret this stuff today? I'd say yes. I think you probably would say yes too, right?
Yeah, and especially because we have so little of the original texts. Whenever someone says like this is exactly it, and when we don't even have some of the really foundational like Zeno's Republic, or
we don't have anything the guy wrote, unfortunately.
Right?
Yeah.
None of the first couple founders we have any of their books. Zeno, Chrysippus, or Cleanthes. Or the first three heads of the Stoa. Like all we got are like quotes from other people's books.
Yeah.
Little fragments.
Sometimes a paragraph of Chrysippus and Galen, who is a medical guy, but he's always quoting Chrysippus to say how wrong Chrysippus is. So.
Was that when he was talking about the heart being the center of rationality?
Oh, yeah. There was there's a bit of a side note, right? There was a big discussion in ancient times about whether it was the brain or whether it was the heart. And a lot of ancient philosophers held out for it being the heart. As a matter of fact, some of them seem to have imagined the brain was almost like a cooling system or something. Now, Plato
just a radiator.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of looks like. I mean, who knows? But
do they have radiators?
I don't think so, but I don't know where they got that idea. But they thought of the heart as being the center of the human being. Plato didn't buy into that because the rational part for him is in the head, and then like the irrational parts are below the neck. But I think a lot of the other philosophers identified it with the heart.
Right.
So going back to this reinterpretation business, right? Why do we have to reinterpret the stuff that we have? Isn't it good enough just to read Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius and Seneca and then just apply it?
I don't think so, because we live in a fundamentally different world than they do. There are certain political and environmental differences that are just so absolutely alien to them that it requires at least some fitting into the modern milieu.
So this is probably something you've thought about quite a bit over the years then. Obviously some things we want to sort of say, well, that was of their time and we're not really that interested in it, like, Epictetus's insistence that men should have beards or else they're effeminate or things like that. I think we could probably say, nah. I mean, although you and I both have beards, we can recognize the beardless as still men, right? And we don't have to stick with the rigid gender roles that they had. And there's other weird, like things here and there where we read a passage and we're like, well, I don't know that we have to buy into that. How do we tell what we should keep? What is still as true today as it was 2,000 years ago?
So I'm more of an empiricist than I'm a rationalist.
Okay.
And so I'm very much in favor of study and research and repeatable large sample size studies for some of these things. And if there is reliable, repeatable, and repeated experimentation that some of these things don't actually hold, then I'm going to drop them. Those things, it's kind of like the Stoics are really great on a lot of things that are kind of psychologically based, because we as a species haven't changed much in the last 2,000 years.
Okay.
But they have a lot of stuff about the cosmos that I do not hold to any at all, because it is way outside of what we have been able to experimentally demonstrate.
Yeah, and I think that some of these things, just given the way that we conceive of the cosmos, there's no way they're going to work, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, in On the Nature of the Gods, which is the closest thing we have to Stoic theology and cosmology, you've got Zeus, who's like this capital G god, and then you've got all these other, let's call them godlets or godlings. And they seem to perform a role similar to what angels were thought to do in, early Christian and Muslim stuff, and governing the universe and making sure like everything goes the way it's supposed to go. But do we really have any evidence that there's anything like this in contemporary cosmology? No, I think we have to like throw all that stuff away. Just as much as we would with more theistic conceptions, that just seems to go by the wayside.
As well as the conflagration.
Well, we should say what that is. Yeah.
So that is
the ekpurosis is how it's called in Greek, right? So
say it again.
Ekpurosis.
Ekpurosis.
Yeah.
And so this is the idea that our world is actually our entire cosmos, which is all things, goes through a rebirth and burning in giant cycles of I don't know, either hundreds of thousands or millions of years.
Yeah, who knows? When it comes to
and they have a conception of matter, that everything kind of like goes up into, eventually it burns up, and then the thing that like flame burns into is reason. And so the entire of all everything, the cosmos,
it's like it's all getting sucked back up into
this like pure fire, and then it becomes new again. It gets reborn into a new version of the universe, and it happens exactly the same way as fate has predicted, because fate is perfectly reasonable, and that it has defined the exact best way that everything should happen.
Yeah. There's a passage in Epictetus's discourses where I think he's kind of joking around, actually, because he as so often he's talking to an interlocutor and he's saying, "Man, your ideas are wrong, and let me give you an instance to show you how wrong they are." And he's talking about it's in the chapter on solitude, and whether solitude is something good or bad for us, right? And Epictetus tells us something that a lot of other ancient authors have said: solitude is really easy to bear if you're a good person, because you like to be with yourself. If you're a bad person, you don't like to be with yourself. And so solitude then becomes something difficult to bear. And the other thing that can make solitude bad is we feel like we're going to be resourceless, like we're not going to have any friends, or we're not going to have what we need to be able to get through things. And so he says, when the conflagration happens, do you think Zeus is like crying to himself because all the other gods are gone and everything else is gone? No, he's fine. He's cool being by himself until everything starts up again. So presumably Epictetus thought of, this thing is happening. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he just thought his audience did. In any case, he refers to it, and he's got this funny line about, imagine if like Zeus was like all sad and morose because nothing exists anymore, and he's sort of like whining. Not much of a god then, is he?
Right. And so, once again, these are certain things that we have decided that from within ancient Stoicism that it could probably be thrown to the dustbin of history.
Yeah. I like your idea that a lot of the psychological stuff still holds. And some of it does seem to be, more and more borne out by what we're discovering through looking at the brain and how it works and therapeutic techniques in psychology and what actually is evidence-based, the whole cognitive revolution. It aligns very nicely with Stoic conceptions of rationality and emotions. So, yeah.
Yeah, and they had lots of time to sit around and talk to each other about what they're thinking and how they're experiencing the world, and that's been our main way until only the last 20 years of investigating our own consciousnesses.
Yeah, and I'm going to say something, and it'll be a little bit of a rant here. I think a lot of people imagine, like, everybody before the dawn of science in the early modern period as being these people who just, like, they didn't do any real experimentation or observation. And that's nuts. I mean, Aristotle was an empiricist in this respect. He liked cutting animals open and seeing what was in their guts. That's why he had Alexander, who was his patron, send back all these animals from, the places that Alexander was marching around. He had hunters along for that. And they were similarly doing that with human beings. They would observe things. Like, again, Aristotle, he in effect, he's Plato, you could say, is founding political science in a certain sense, but Aristotle founded it by actually looking at what each Greek city-state, what its constitution was, and then writing, or at least maybe he didn't necessarily write it, maybe he had some of his students write it, writing out these treatises and establishing like a research program and allowing him to make, interesting generalizations. And the Stoics did exactly the same thing. They were not just like coming up with a bunch of ideas and then saying, all right, how can we impose these on everybody and, make them fit? No, they look at how people behave, and they saw what worked and what didn't work in terms of moving people away from destructive habits and towards, healthier and more productive habits. And eventually towards, what they called eudaimonia, that we now call like happiness or fulfillment or, being okay.
Yeah. And that was like the major question at the time. Like that's at least a major philosophical question in ancient Greece, especially in Athens. We have the Stoics, we have the Cynics, we have the Epicureans, we have, to a certain extent, the Lyceum and the Aristotelians, all asking what makes a good life. And so there was a lot of like investigation into that particular question.
So let's come back to the pro-social thing again. Can you have a good life in isolation, or let's even go further than that, being indifferent to or being in conflict with other people? Some people thrive on drama, right? Is that a good life?
I don't believe that thriving on drama is a good life. Not, I guess, specifically from a Stoic point of view. Then the basis of your happiness is an external, and the Stoics say that your basis for a good life or your own happiness should be from within.
Yeah.
And so I guess the Stoic would say that you could have a good life by yourself. But it might be preferable to be with other people just because we are a social creature.
Yeah, for example, there were a lot of famous Stoics who wound up getting exiled, right? Musonius Rufus got exiled twice, I think. Seneca was
Seneca?
Yeah. And also Seneca had to write letters of consolation to other people who got exiled as well, right?
And then he was told to commit suicide.
True, yeah. And Cicero had to go into exile. Not exactly a Stoic, but he followed the Stoics in a lot of things. So, the idea is you should be able to handle being on your own, but there's more to life than just withdrawing to some barren rock and living an ascetic life, deprived of other people. So what's the other side of that? What's involved with this pro-social part?
This, I guess, it could bring up okiosas, which is a idea of appropriating the not the desires, but the
affection,
the well-being,
yeah,
of others into your own as much as you can. And so it's described as a number of concentric circles by, I believe, Pericles.
Yeah.
Describes it this way. And where you are the center, and then your next circle is like your parents and maybe your closest siblings, and then after that is your extended family, after that is your neighborhood, after that is your city, their nation, and then the world, and then maybe the cosmos, or like the realm of all rational creatures.
Yeah.
And the idea of okiosas is to try to, you might not succeed, but try to extend the thinking about the consequences of your actions to the same extent that you would think about the consequences of your actions and how they would affect those people closest to you. And so you're trying to contract these circles down to you.
Yeah, you could say that if there are emotions associated with oikiosis, it's love or affection, right? And concern or care. Aristotle, who's not a Stoic, talks about friendship as if you want a genuine friendship, it has to involve wishing well to the other for their own sake, not for the sake of what you're getting out of them, not because they're an important person who's going to save the universe, but just because they matter, And that's why he says, like, you can't be friends with salt, for example, because salt, you can eat it as much as you like and really like it, but you don't care about it for its own sake the way you can a person. And the Stoics acknowledged this emotion that in Greek is called philostorgia, and it gets translated as familial affection, but it really can pertain to anybody who we're attached to. It's translated sometimes as fondness. And so oikiosis would be an extension of that deliberately, from the people who we already feel that about to people who we don't already feel that about, and then eventually with time can come to feel that way. And we did a show about this a while back. I don't remember exactly what episode it was, but you talked about Buddhist meta-meditation as being similar to this with the concentric circles. And then if I remember
as
right...
well as...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Peter Sellers, his book, The Expanding Circle, which is very similar, but expanding instead of
effective altruism. And utilitarianism tied in with that. So this is kind of a cross-cultural concept, isn't it?
It is. And one of those things that made me look into Buddhism just to see what are the other things that might be.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, a little bit. I'm not super versed, but I've read a couple books now. And
so that was the thing that got you interested in that concentric circles of meta-meditation.
That, and I came upon a book that looked at Buddhism through a scientific lens, and it says basically we've done some
which
brain
one was
scan
it?
studies.
Do you remember the name?
Yeah, it's called Why Buddhism is True.
That's right. Yeah.
I don't know where I put it. It's around here someplace. But yeah, I thought it was a really interesting way of looking at that and kind of, breaking the wheat from the chaff, getting to things that I can say, oh yeah, there is some, good scientific backing on these ideas.
Yeah, and from, I would say from a typical Stoic perspective, actually Lawrence Becker talks about this in A New Stoicism, in talking about how to interpret the Stoics' insistence on living in accordance with nature. And Becker says that's a terrible phrase. It's too bad that the Stoics are stuck with it because it could mean so many different things. And then he decides that part of it means living in accordance with the facts, or living in accordance with the best knowledge that we have about the cosmos, our bodies, our psychology, that any real, as he calls it, a new Stoicism, any real Stoicism would have to be adaptable. So if we find out that, I don't know, some key Stoic practice is actually harmful, according to Becker, we should abandon it.
And so I feel like this is a really good segue into the three disciplines, and specifically the discipline of ascent. Unless there's something that you really needed to talk about.
I thought you were going to talk about the case that we'll bring up in a couple of minutes, because that's a person who clearly misunderstood something about Stoicism. But let's talk about the three disciplines, and then let's talk about that interesting situation.
So specifically, so the three Stoic disciplines, as put forward, I believe by Epictetus, right?
Right.
Are desire, action, and assent, and they are three kind of categories of looking and interacting with the world that help, that support each other, kind of like a tripod, and that you kind of have to have all three of them in the Stoic sense of these for kind of the whole philosophy to work well.
Yeah.
And assent is all about being aware of the world and investigating it as best you can. They knew about optical illusions even back then, and so they knew that like you look out and like maybe the tree kind of looks weird, like it's bent, but then you like walk around it and you realize it's just like a weird way it was growing. It's not actually bent, or it's just like the bark looked weird. And so it's like, you see all these things and you have these first impressions, but you need to reserve just assenting to these things just because you see them. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself in a world of hurt, because there are lots of things that we interact with the world where our first impressions are absolutely incorrect.
And our second and thirds too.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think he's like, what was the idea of the hand? Like,
that's coming from Zeno. Yeah.
Yeah, like this is like the impression. This is like knowing, and this is understanding.
Something along those lines. Yeah, and assent enters in there. And this actually, by the way, this treatment of, so like the Stoics would say that you've got like these impressions that come in, and then there's a moment where we decide whether we're going to give in to them or not, whether we're going to like withdraw a little bit from them and then sort of assess them or test them, or before we entertain them, or we can assent to them automatically, and then afterwards there's the consequences of doing that. This made its way into a lot of non-Stoic thought within the Middle Ages. So you see this same pattern being worked out. Why? Because the medieval monks read Seneca and Cicero, because they copied them. They liked those pagan authors, and so Stoicism found its way into the psychology of the Middle Ages as well.
And then this is also where we get the Serenity Prayer from.
Yeah, I suppose
infusion of Stoic thought into Christianity.
Another thing. This is a bit of a side note. Another thing that made its way in through the monastic culture was some of the ascetic practices. We're just like taken wholesale out of Stoic ideas, and then just these monks are like, well, this stuff works, let's use it. We're not going to just reject it because it's not coming straight out of the Bible. They were way more judicious when it came to that. They realized you had to synthesize things that you could use.
There's even traditions of meditation in some ancient monastic traditions that got weeded out as not being Christian at some point in time.
Yeah, it depends. It really depends on like who's in charge of determining what counts, And some of that had to do with religious orders kind of sticking it to each other. So the older religious orders sometimes are at a disadvantage compared to the younger ones. But this is where I'm liable as somebody who's like a medievalist to get into some not only get into the weeds, but also get into stuff where I've got some real strong opinions, because I'm a big proponent of the Benedictines against the Dominicans and Franciscans and later Jesuits, but that's a whole different side note.
So maybe we should talk about the discipline of desire, what you should be desiring in this moment.
What I should be?
Well,
You
or
mean
I
like?
guess under a Stoic idea of desire. I'm just trying to get us back on
Yeah,
track.
well, I mean, the Stoic idea, the Stoic discipline of desire is what's really liberating about it. I think a lot of people think that I just desire what I desire, and it also includes aversions. I'm averse to what I'm averse to, and that's just the way I'm made. And the Stoics say, no, you're really malleable, by directing your attention, by using things to remind yourself of what the consequences are. You can change how you desire things. You can't, of course, like flip a switch or take a pill or put a chip in your head and automatically desire the right things. But you can, you can wean yeah, we'll see about that. You can wean yourself away from bad things and towards better things.
And this is what we were talking about just earlier about habits and creating these habits by doing them over and over.
Right.
That you instill certain actions that then become second nature.
And Epictetus talks, I've been mentioning Epictetus a lot tonight, but he is my favorite Stoic, so that's probably why. As a matter of fact, before I say what Epictetus is going to say, who's your favorite Stoic? Do you have one?
I guess it's Marcus Aurelius.
I was thinking it probably was.
I guess as a pure prose, I love Marcus Aurelius.
Okay.
And
yeah, Epictetus is a little bit more dry.
Although he has some really gut busters
I know.
once in a while, and I think because he's so dry a lot of the other times, it kind of amplifies their he's making a joke here real hardcore.
Yeah. So let me ask, why not Seneca?
Seneca's next.
Okay.
Because I love the letters, and it's just this correspondence that goes on forever, and it's kind of it's at least the letters to Lucilius are almost like a course in Stoicism.
Yeah.
I find that to be really enjoyable to read.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I think that's part of why they were preserved in the form that they were, because they were held to be almost covering every topic you could think of. The other thing that's really cool about those letters, I'll say too, is that we know, I mentioned Chrysippus, we know about him in part because Galen, talked about him in order to go against him. We also know about Chrysippus from what Epictetus and then even more Seneca have to say. There's passages where he'll quote Chrysippus or other authors like Posidonius, a middle Stoic. Sometimes we get passages, but we also get a lot of summaries where he'll say, well, as we all know, Posidonius taught this. And Seneca's the only place where we've got anyone telling us. So we're well, we didn't all know, but thank goodness you wrote it down. So, well, with the Epictetus, so the habit thing, right? I was just going to say, Epictetus tells us that when we're in a tempting situation, we should remind ourselves we're not just deciding for right now, we're deciding whether to strengthen or weaken a habit. And I think that's a really helpful thing I know for me, it's very helpful to keep that in mind when I'm tempted to justify what I'm doing. So speaking of justification, I've mentioned a couple times this interesting case of a guy, Samuel Jackson, not the actor, but a guy who worked for Lidl, which is a German firm that they find they're all across Europe.
And a grocery store, right?
Yeah, and in this case, it was a guy who was apparently in communications and said some bad things about his coworkers, and then was told to apologize, made a bad apology, got fired, and then claimed that he did it because of Stoicism. So this is actually just quoting from Personnel Today, an article about this. He argued that his philosophical beliefs formulated by Zeno of Citium and taught in ancient Athens meant he must adhere to the truth without fear of offending other people. Now, Stoicism does say that we should adhere to the truth. It doesn't say that, we shouldn't fear offending other people, but we also shouldn't offend other people. We shouldn't deliberately go out of our way to say things, as he did, that are racist, and then, would certainly affect his coworkers, and then not apologize properly for it. And so it's interesting because the judge actually said that Stoicism counts as a philosophy. Now, it's not like here in the United States where it would have to be like covered under the First Amendment and religion. In this case, in Britain, a philosophy, like say veganism, can be a sufficient reason why you're treating people differently. The funny thing about this is the guy's getting Stoicism wrong, and the judge didn't seem to catch that, right? And they even end up like quoting the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which I think is actually getting Stoicism wrong too. So it's unfortunate because what this guy is doing is definitely not Stoicism. You know, saying racist remarks about coworkers, not a Stoic thing to do. Doubling down on it.
It's not pro-social.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and there's no like, well, why did you do this? Why would you say this sort of thing? He clearly thinks that the racist remark is a true remark.
And he's making a statement that has facticity. He's saying that a certain group is greasy, and that is a fact. A statement.
It's not a fact.
It is a statement that has the ability to be proven true or false, and it is demonstrably false.
Yeah.
And so he is unwise to be choosing to stick to his guns on this.
Yeah, and any good Stoic would, when confronted by other people saying, "Wow, you're a jerk," would like look at themselves and say, "Am I a jerk? Let me think about this behavior on my part. What are my motivations for saying these things that are offensive?" I think this is something that's kind of interesting because this is something really important to personal development. It requires us to have a sense of humility, being willing to acknowledge when we've got something wrong. And Marcus Aurelius is somebody who says, hey, if I'm wrong about something, let me know so I can fix it. This guy is like the opposite of that, right?
Right. He's planted his leg in the ground for a really poor place and decided that he's going to defend that hill come, heck or high water.
Yeah. That's and we talk about a hill to die on. It's not actually Stoic to do that. What would make a hill worth dying on is that it's like, it embodies something of high value, like you're protecting people or you're actually doing your duty to your country or something along those lines.
So, for example, if you're when you join the government or the armed services in this country, you are sworn to protect and defend the Constitution. And so there's a duty to potentially do things that would be against the wishes of your commanding officers if it conflicts with this thing that you have sworn to do. That's
true. Yeah, and actually, all I can remember, I was in the Army, and I remember that we were told we're not supposed to obey unlawful orders. And there was discussion about, well, what is a lawful order? What's an unlawful order? Most of the orders that you get are lawful. But if they tell you hey, we're going to pick some guy at random and beat the tar out of him, that's an unlawful order. I mean, you could have some cases where it could somehow be construed to be the right thing. I mean, that's what A Few Good Men was about, that whole movie, right? But you'd have to do some reasoning there. And so, this is a great case of somebody who's using Stoicism as you put it, a shield in order to cover up bad actions on his part that a genuine Stoic would be condemning.
Yeah, and also his epistemology is really bad, or the way that he knows how things, the way that things.
Right. Yeah. from the Stoics' perspective, they called that part logic, right? And that's where the desire of assent also came in, or the discipline of assent. You studied how to tell true statements from false statements, how to tell good inferences from bad inferences, and any sort of sweeping stereotype. I mean, there are some cases where a few stereotypes might actually be correct, but we'd have to be really, really careful to figure out which of those they are. And I think in this day and age, we should probably assume that any sweeping statement about an entire class of people is probably going to be false. Right.
There's too many people, and people are way too varied to have any of those statements really, besides like, we're all human, thus we'll die.
Yeah. So, do we want to get into the question? We're going to have to run through that in the practice pretty quickly, or do we just want to jump right to the practice? I did have somebody who messaged me on Twitter today with an interesting Stoic
Let's do
question.
The question quick.
Okay. So somebody messaged me and he said, I was wondering how a Stoic outlook would reflect on mental health conditions vis-a-vis how we treat them in terms of medication. I understand that none of this pharmaceutical advancement was present at the height of Stoic philosophy, but just how, out of principle, how might we think about this? I was thinking in terms of whether taking mind-altering medication would be viewed as unvirtuous, contradicting a person's responsibility to take a hold of their personal pain. And so, this is a great example of what you were talking about earlier, where a modern interpretation of Stoicism is going to differ from an ancient interpretation. But even then, if Epictetus knew that somebody had some sort of chemical imbalance in their brain and probably needed something to even them out to some degree, I don't think he would have been against it. I don't think he would have said, tough it out,
Like I look at Stoicism as the things that help us, once our brains are in like a fairly neurotypical, at least chemical basis, we have these, what did Freud call them, or neuroses or whatever, these ways of thinking about the world that are purely just, the patterns that we have developed, and not a fundamentally medical problem with our brain as an organ.
Yeah, now we use the word disorder, but you're right. And some things, are going to be caused by organic issues, and some will be caused by trauma that might require psychotherapy that's not going to be helped just by doing Stoic exercises, and some things can be addressed by philosophical practices, but we have to be able to discern between those things. And I kind of think that a combination can often be quite helpful. I look at a lot of psychiatric medicine as essentially giving people crutches. It's great when you get a crutch, but the crutch by itself doesn't heal your leg. It helps you get around, so it helps you have the mobility that you need, but you're going to have to do some physical therapy as well. And the physical therapy is doing either the psychotherapy or the Stoic work, right? So if all you do is take, let's say you're depressed, right? And you just take a bunch of antidepressants, well, that's nice. It'll keep you even for a while, but you might actually want to look at why you're depressed. What other things besides just, brain states are involved in that. Like, if you find out that like every relationship that you had crashed and burned, and look at the fact that, you're the only constant in that, and then you're like, oh, I better look at how I interact with people. Maybe Stoicism can actually help with that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. And practice?
Yeah, why don't you lead us through this one?
Our practice this week is that of the mistaken inference, and it was put forward this way. Someone comes up to you and says, I make more money than you, therefore I am better than you. And you can retort, well, the horse runs faster than you, therefore is the horse better than you? And this is this question of, like, what is the actual good here? If you kind of desire money to be a good, but does that, just because you desire it to be good, does it actually make it a good?
Yeah. So we're pretty much out of time now. So do we want to lead out on a final thought? Or?
We'll lead out with the words of Epictetus. People are upset not by things, but their judgment about things.